Well, we're live in some places potentially, and not live in others. I don't know. It's okay. Well, thank you for everybody that is listening live or in other places. We're all over. We should be on Instagram right now and YouTube, and then some people are right here on Riverside watching us. Really appreciate all of you guys because we have an important topic to talk about. If you're listening to this live, today is the day before January 6th. If you're listening to this when the episode comes out, it is January 6th or after that. 5 years since that really weird event that it's going to be on textbooks. I'm going to be teaching my kids this. It's going to be really bizarre to say like I was like alive during that time. Um, and that's going to be a weird experience, but we'll get into the nitty gritty of that Christian nationalism, not just talking about the U.S. Capitol attack, but everything else, all the other odds and ends involved in that. But to start off today, I want to tell a little bit of a story, and this happened back in a fateful time, back during the 2016 election. I was a cheap labor for many churches, and I did a little preaching circuit in the Pacific Northwest. And I was a guest preacher at this one church um, in Washington State. And I was a spicy young. I don't remember if I was 19 or 20. I was pretty young, and I decided to preach on politics because I said you can't go wrong with just preaching the Bible and talking about what is it, John 18, Jesus and Pilate, and all this kingdoms not of this world stuff. Great stuff, right? Well, turns out people had a lot of reactions to that, especially during that 2016 election. And that was my first taste of, oh, wait a second. There are some people here, including some old ladies that tried to instruct me afterward, who view things very differently and do think there is such a goal as some kind of physical geopolitical kingdom of God. Like that is part of the whole Christian mission. But we want to resist that today. And so I've gathered this crew here to help us resist Christian nationalism. Um, what brings everybody together is they have previously been on the podcast, Christianity Without Compromise, talking about some of these topics, talking about some different intersections here. They're all super smart people and with different backgrounds and different stuff. I'll send it to them in a second, but they're really cool. And I'm sure we'll have more conversations with different perspectives and different things in the future. But for right now, I got my friends here, Joash, Jared, Larry, and Caleb, and they'll introduce themselves in a second. Um, but just wanted to say to them and to the audience, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. This is an important topic. So before we get into things, because I want to try to wrap this up within an hour. I'm on a standing desk right now, a little behind the scenes stuff. So like, don't make me stand too long tonight. Somebody start us off. Tell us a little about yourself, who you are, what you've written, whatever you want to bring to the table today.
I want to hear
Jared,
from Jared.
go for it, or somebody. I don't know.
Okay, I'll get us started, and then I'll hand it off to one of you. My name is Jared Stacy. I grew up in evangelical Christianity in America. I'm a Liberty University alumni. Went to a grade school associated with D.L. Moody, and was a Southern Baptist pastor for close to 10 years. And my trajectory took me to Aberdeen, Scotland, where I was studying for about 4 years. January 6th was something local for me. I was a college pastor, young adults pastor, at a church just 40 miles down the road when January 6th happened. By that time, I had already resigned and was packing up to go to Scotland. And for about 4 years, I studied theological ethics and specifically took a look at the way that conspiracy theories work inside Christian nationalism, inside my community, right? White evangelicals are my people, for better or worse. I can't tell my story without this community, this community of people, and the political consequences alongside of it. I don't describe myself as an evangelical in that sense anymore. I'm very interested in articulating what it means to be post-evangelical, what it means to still be a confessing Christian in the midst of this moment. And a lot of that comes out of my work. And I was also gesturing towards other expressions of Christianity that still remain within the very broad ecumenical tradition. One thing I found in studying in Aberdeen, and then I'll throw it over to the Right Reverend Larry, is that there were a lot of answers, a lot of really rich, deep theological articulations of how to resist what I would call Christianity, what I have now learned to call something like Christian nationalism or Constantinian Christianity. There's so many different names for it. I called it Christianity. So imagine my surprise when I found and discovered that a lot of the answers, or a lot of the ways to resist, a lot of the ways of faithfulness, the paths of faithfulness, these paths have been forged. They've been walked for generations and centuries faithfully. And so there's not a lot that we have to invent. There's just a way of faithfulness that I think in many ways we can recapture, we can renew, and that's what my work is kind of gearing me towards. The last thing I'll say, I have a book coming out that kind of encapsulates all this together. It comes out this year. It's called Reality and Ruins: How Conspiracy Theory Became an American Evangelical Crisis, and that's coming out in March. I'll throw it over to Larry.
I appreciate it, Jared. It's such an honor to be here. I feel willing to bet like I'm probably the least famous person in this call, so I don't even know how I made the cut, but I'm so thankful to be here. Just to give you a little bit of my background, I grew up in San Jose, California. My parents were Chinese immigrants, and I grew up. They became Christians right around the time I was born, and so I grew up in a Chinese immigrant church. It was like a large 1,000-person non-denominational conservative evangelical church. And then I went to college on the East Coast, and I was really plugged into Cru as a student. And so I worked for Cru, the college ministry in the DC area afterwards for a bit. And then I started interning at a Southern Baptist church in Baltimore. My wife had moved up. We were dating long distance. She moved up there to Baltimore. And so I just followed her there. And I ended up staying there for 8 years, not all as an intern, but my title changed a few times. And during those 8 years, I experienced a little bit of a transition. Some of it was the nature of living in Baltimore. That was my first time living in a majority Black city, and also a larger urban area as well, as opposed to my suburban context. And just being exposed to the different ways different Christians practice their faith, and the different ways people practice their politics. Because my prior context was I was very theologically and politically conservative. And just being in Baltimore those 8 years, I changed my mind on a number of issues. And it got to the point such that by 2021, I definitely didn't feel aligned with the Southern Baptist Convention. And I wasn't sure if I was aligned with the label evangelical. And so I stepped down as a pastor. And I ended up working for a nonprofit. They're called the One America Movement, and they exist to help resource clergy on how to build bridges and to battle polarization. So I was there for a year and a half, and that was really refreshing for me. It was just what I needed. But at the end of that, I felt called back to go back into pastoral ministry. So I did. So now I'm at another church in the Baltimore area. It's called Grace Life Church, and we're non-denominational. Formerly Southern Baptist, and we're kind of nuanced on a bunch of theological issues, which is what I prefer. And so I don't know how I identify in terms of theology. I would say I'm theologically moderate, probably a little bit right of center theologically, and then politically I'm a little bit left of center politically. So that's how I am. But the reason why I guess I got this invite is I just over the years I've also just done a lot of writing on the side, and so there are a few times that I was featured on a few websites, and then I have like a very small Threads following, and so that's how I got connected with Jake. Thankful to be here.
Glad to have you.
Joash, Caleb. Sorry, Caleb.
Oh no, you can. Yeah, whatever.
I serve as a pastor at Desert Springs Bible Church in Phoenix, Arizona. I met the Lord at this church in 2001, came on staff in 2006. became the lead pastor in 2015, 3 weeks after the Golden Escalator situation, and had no idea what was coming my way. And for about 4 years, 2016 to 2020, experienced profound disorientation as a lot of like my people, and I don't just mean like, ethnically or category, like this is my church, right? Like I met the Lord at this church, people that I'd shared communion with, mothers and fathers of the faith, who had welcomed me with rave reviews as the lead pastor. Now 6 months, a year later, are accusing me of being a Marxist, an atheist. Eventually, I got accused of being demon possessed because of our church's stance on immigration care, refugee care, racism, which is a part of my background and testimony, things that we had been doing, we continue to do during that season. And I was in 2020, I mean, it was like every other day I'm getting emails, phone calls, people are printing out packets, leaving them on my door, knocking and running away, accusing me of buying into, an atheist agenda. So it was extremely disorienting for me, and physically taxing. So I got COVID in June, shingles in July, and facial paralysis in August of 2020. So leading up to January 6, 2021 was a pretty taxing season for me. The first sermon I did back, I had half of my face worked, the first 3 sermons actually. And I was ready to quit, and glad to talk more about this if you want to, but through a variety of different circumstances, decided to stay. At the same time, Turning Point USA was setting up shop 3 miles down the street from where I'm currently sitting. And a lot of my people who were still there in 2020 were handing me flyers in the lobby of the church after service saying, "You've got to come, Pastor Caleb. It's a revival." And so I went with one of my leaders and was just terrified by what I saw, just rampant syncretism and the conflation of certain aspects of evangelicalism and certain aspects of political Americana that were synced up as if they were one thing. And I came to the conclusion that people aren't having really a political experience as much as they're having a spiritual experience. And so I set about trying to understand the American Christian nationalist movement through a missiological lens. So thinking in terms of the mission of the church, evangelism, things like that. And wrote a book called Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor, which came out in 2024 on the 4th of July, 2024. Actually, it was July 2nd, but we're going to call it 4th.
We can say award-winning book, can't we?
Ooh.
Really, just you can say whatever you want as long as you're talking about my book, Jared. Yeah, it is an award-winning book. Yeah, and it came out of the number one pastoral question I was getting from the folks who stuck around. So about 80% of my church that was there in 2016 had left by the end of 2020. And the ones who stuck around were also disoriented. And the number one pastoral question I was getting is, how do I talk to my Aunt Betty? She's yelling and screaming at the 12-year-old's birthday party about lizard people running the government, or 25,000 drug dealing rapists invading the southern border paid for by George Soros. How do I talk to her? Or how do I talk to my cousin Jim, or my coworker Steve? So I wrote the book, and a lot of my ministry, now 5 years later, has been trying to help theological evangelicals engage those who have given themselves over to Christian nationalism in America today. And I will call on Joash.
Thanks, Caleb. Well, it's good to be here among friends. This is, conversations like this is so much needed, especially right now. And I have so much respect for you folks on here. So my name is Joash Thomas. I get to serve as a public theologian to the Western Church. And I also am a first-time author, just have a book that just came out, The Justice of Jesus. Basically a book about my own journey. Just to give a little bit of a snapshot, my family's been Christian 2,000 years, going to what Jared talked about, ancient ways of understanding God and neighbor. My family's been worshiping Jesus since many Europeans were worshiping Thor. We heard the gospel from the Apostle Thomas, who brought the gospel from Jesus directly. And over the last 2,000 years, my family has been everything from Orthodox to Catholic to Anglican to Pentecostal for the last 5 generations, my dad's side. So I grew up, Pentecostal evangelical in the Global South Church. Oh, thanks, Caleb. Caleb's just like nicely featuring my book back there. Appreciate you, Reverend Doctor. So for me, when I was 18, I moved to the States and essentially lost myself, lost everything that was unique about me, felt this pressure as an immigrant to assimilate by empire. Ended up working in Georgia Republican politics for a few years. So very much the underbelly of the beast of the American empire, I'd describe it as. And, but really got to see people from the inside and see that people are just people and people are motivated by trauma and fear and anxiety. And these are good people with the image of God in them. And over the last 10 years, basically went from Republican politics in the South to international human rights around 2015, 2016. Just felt like my time there was over. And for the last decade, I've worked in international human rights, helping rescue children from trafficking around the world, women, children from violence, sexual exploitation, labor trafficking, all of that. And that's really where I met Jesus in a fresh way, transformed my life. So I'm now on a journey of, I am an ordained minister in the church, in the Anglican world. And I am about to be ordained as a priest in a couple of weeks here. So really excited about that calling. And just really grateful to be a part of conversations like this. So yeah, back to you, Jake.
Well, thank you, everybody, for giving those little backstories. I think that's really important to frame the context and explain why you are here, because each and every one of you has a unique take and angle on this. You thought about it, you've written about it, you've lived it in some cases. So I think that's really important. And I think the best way to begin is just talk about why are we freaking out about this thing? Like, why are we making such a hubbub about Christian nationalism? So anybody who wants to, what is the danger here? And maybe in your answer, if you want to nuance a little bit of how's that different than just Christians interacting in politics? So anybody who wants it, don't take forever because we got other people who might want to say something too.
Or I'll bite. I'll just start off with saying I remember Russell Moore saying something like this. If you're not familiar, editor in chief of Christianity Today, he when the church gets in bed with politics, it's bad. I mean, when the church gets in bed with the state, it's bad for the state and it's bad for the church, right? And I think a lot of the news going on in the world, when we talk about Christian nationalism, a lot of the focus is on the harm to the state, like what's going on with the immigrants and what's going on with our laws, what's going on with society. But as a pastor, I care about those things. I care about our country as well. But uh, probably my primary concern is the way it has corrupted the church. And there's just so many people who are receiving, I would say, anti-gospel teaching in their churches that is basically Christian nationalism in disguise. And a lot of these teachings, they run counter to Jesus' teachings himself. I mean, just the lust for power, the lust for control, an approval for violence, and like a lot of these, even the permission to hate other people, to justify basically, I would say, political cheating to win, an election, lying, like all of these things that are anti-fruit of the spirit, anti-gospel, are being highlighted and put on display. And so I think that's why that's one of the reasons why Christian nationalism is so dangerous and why I'm so concerned about it.
Yeah, I'll jump in next. I'll describe it as this way from my own journey. So, working in Georgia Republican politics, I was taught that Christian engagement in the public square is advocating for Christian rights, like the right to pray in schools, the right to have the Ten Commandments up, things like that. And then I had those illusions shattered for me when I went back to the global church, the global South church, and, did the work of anti-human trafficking with the local church in contexts like India, persecuted church contexts, even where Christians had every right to be advocating for themselves while being in the minority, but would still go out there, expose themselves to their government leaders, not on behalf of themselves, but on behalf of those with lesser privilege than them, on behalf of their trafficked neighbors, right? And when I saw the church do that in the global South, to me that reminded me of Jesus in Philippians chapter 2, who empties himself of his divine rights and privileges and makes himself nothing. And I saw that and I was like, this is it. This is exactly what Christian advocacy and Christian political engagement should look like, where our primary client is not ourselves, not our own rights, but the rights of those who have less, right, who have less than us. Period. Right, and because that's the Jesus thing to do. The Jesus thing to do is to stand in the gap. And so Christian nationalism, I think, I often get asked by well-meaning folks on the right, not that I identify on the left, but often get asked, hey, look, like, what's the difference between what you're saying that, the state should prioritize justice for the marginalized and Christian nationalism? Isn't that your own, left version of Christian nationalism or whatever? And I say, actually, no, the difference between Christian nationalism and what I think is faithful Christian advocacy is Christian nationalism advocates for my rights in the public square, and Christian advocacy is the rights of my neighbor who has less than me, because that's the Jesus thing to do.
Yeah, hearing you, Joash, kind of describe that, it reminded me of something that Bonhoeffer talked about in the 1933, German context. And I think knowing I still have, connections and friends that would kind of describe themselves in these terms as Christian nationalists. And it's always difficult to, in some ways, go back to this period of time, like 1930s Germany, because the implication, right, is that anyone who's doing these things is just reflexively associated with National Socialism. So before I go down that road and quote Bonhoeffer, I want to acknowledge that there is a resistance against Christian nationalism that came out of minorities and slavery here in America. And this is, Jamar Tisby has talked about this and written about this in length. But when we're talking about Christian nationalism in America, we can go outside of America in contexts that have wrestled against forms of nationalism in their own way, but we can also look here, right, in our own state and find that there is a faithful witness that has emerged from beneath empire. Frederick Douglass is a great proponent, a great witness in that way. And there's so many others, but Bonhoeffer's quote in particular, I think, resonates with what Joash was saying, in that, the church has an obligation to any victims of any society. And so he was making an assumption that any society, whether that society is communist or capitalist, whether that society is a democracy or a monarchy, right? So I lived in the UK for a couple of years, and it taught me that in my resistance to Christian nationalism, I have to be very particular about the way I talk, because, and Joash knows this, there is an established church in the UK, right? So the Anglican Communion is tied to not just Parliament, but tied to King Charles III. So we have to be open about that. There's all these different political forms. So what makes Christian nationalism unique? And I think Bonhoeffer put his finger on something, and the same way that Cohn puts his finger on something in the United States, when he talks about to understand Christ in America is to understand the lynching tree. It's to understand what does empire do, and who does empire leave behind, and how does a Christian politics respond to that need. And I think that's what we're really trying to do. And I want to extend sort of a definition and even an olive branch, right, for those who feel like they're accused of being a Christian nationalist just because they want to see Christian values, quote unquote, in the public square. I want to dismantle that sort of definition, like that. And Jake, your question laid that bare. Like, what are we talking about when we say Christian nationalism? Is it just Christians engaging in politics? And no, Christian nationalism is not, as I understand it, Christians engaging in politics. The way I've come to define it is Christian nationalism works in America sort of like a nesting doll, where you package this ethnic identity of whiteness, and I realize that's an academic term, but you can do the reading and work on that, and figure out where that came from. But this cultural identity, right? So a cultural identity that's packaged then inside a broader civic identity. So like what it means to be white is also then what it means to be American, and what it means to be American is then tied up with what it means to be Christian, and that's how it's kind of received. That's how I received it. Like for me, I sat in a GOP 2015. It was a prayer rally, and Bobby Jindal was the vice presidential candidate, or the presidential candidate at that time. And he told his testimony and prayed, and I realized in that moment like something was off. I had a sense of unease, not because a public figure was sharing his testimony, but because in that moment I felt that there was other other forces at play, other things at work. It was beyond just the church being the church. And it was this, and Caleb's used the word synced up. And that's exactly what it is. When you can't discriminate and differentiate between conservative ideology or progressive ideology and the gospel of Jesus, essentially resisting Christian nationalism, as I understand it, means playing with all your cards on the table and letting the word confront you in all of your decisions and who you choose to stand with. And so I appreciate Joash and Larry what you've each said. And I'm curious because I know I'm curious to hear from the pastors here too, like Larry, Joash, Caleb. I was a pastor for 10 years. I'm not anymore. My day job is I'm a chaplain, right? So it's a little different, but I'm interested to hear, because Caleb's whole story that he lays out in his book is compelling, but it's also something that he's living out in your own context with TPUSA in your backyard. So I venture, Caleb, that you get asked this question all the time, and you have a much more polished and quick response to disarm it. So I'm curious to hear that.
Yeah, missiologically, so thinking about the mission of the church, the conflation of church and state misrepresents the gospel. I'll give you one example. In the 1940s, America was at war with Germany and Japan. And near the end of that season, we dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. One of the atomic bombs went off on a large Christian community, and yet the local newspaper still called it the Christian bomb. So states do stuff that the church ought not to do. Warfare, espionage, I would even put in taxation. These are things that the state is expected to do. States do this all the time. Totally normal. When you put Christian in front of it, all it does is it leverages the weight of people's faith to sanctify the actions of the state. So Christians acting within the state does not make the action or the state Christian. So I would say it's a categorical, the idea of a Christian state is a categorical error. Mm-hmm. It's simply the state leveraging what it thinks is some sort of divine power to justify its acts. And my proof would be world history. Just look at the various ways that Christians govern. So by no means do I advocate for a separatism or an escapism, but a Christian acting does not make the action Christian. Christianity, what we use the term Christian, is full allegiance to Jesus. So that would be my first one, is missiologically, it wounds the witness of the church globally. Because like I have a friend who served for 20 years as a missionary in Afghanistan. He said to me, because I'm an American, 90% of my time is trying to convince my neighbors I don't want to kill them. Because America is presenting itself as a Christian nation. He's a Christian American, et cetera, et cetera. 2, at the local parish level, regardless of the ideology, the American Christian nationalist movement is fueled by rage and anxiety. And it's anxiety about ethnic erasure. There's a group of people who feel like their way of being is under imminent threat. And this movement promises that if we create enough enemies, or keep the enemies out, or other them, the Democrats, the libs, the wokes, the whatever, then we will be safe. So it's a misplaced trust for safety, belonging, and purpose. Secondly, I would just notice it's not actual real safety, because you can't ask critical questions about the leadership. If you ask the wrong question, you're out, which means it's not a real safe community. but it's presenting itself as a righteous Jesus-led movement and community. But in reality, if you bring the words of Jesus to bear on the leadership, you're out. So on the ground at the parish level, it's disintegrating families, churches, marriages, because it thrives on stirring up anxiety and rage.
Well, thank you everybody for those answers there, helping us nuance it, helping us identify. Again, why are we making a big deal about? Why do we have a live stream? Why do we have a roundtable with all this? Because it impacts things, and I love. And I was hoping you guys went here. We talked a lot about how that impacts the church and things like that. Um, that matters. We've all seen in our various contexts. It changes people. Um, man, I can think of some names and things and think of some people that have changed in the last 5-10 years, and it's scary to see that, and it's unfortunate that people are putting their allegiance into things other than Jesus, and all of us have that pastoral spirit that do not want to see that. Well, we're about halfway through here, so let's jump to the second half here and talk about what do we do, guys? Like, how do we resist this? I called this resisting Christian nationalism. Um, what is our response to these forces on the church, on the state that impacts people in America, abroad, everywhere? What do we do? What do we do? So, whoever wants to take it in whatever direction, what do we do in response here?
So I've thought about this question a lot, and it informed some of my like academic work. Like as an ethicist, you're always kind of thinking like, how is this going to cash out? Where does the rubber meet the road? And those are meaningful questions. But I've also been influenced by, and I would say this, there's many types of Christian ethics. There's not just like Christian ethics. There's many different articulations of and answers to this question of how should we live? And it's a question that we should take seriously. And I want to go back to something that you mentioned, Jake, about people kind of changing. Like we've changed too, right? We've all changed markedly. And I'm also recognizing that we've probably put ourselves in positions publicly where those who disagree with us would say the exact same thing, right? That we've traded we've traded our birthright for, just like Jacob and Esau, we've traded our birthright for, the stew, or, that whole trading, that biblical narrative that's there. And so it really kind of raises this question of, well, who's right? And that's where I think Christian ethics comes in and reminds us that God is the one who holds good and evil in his hands, that it's his decision that we seek, and it's not something that truth is not something that we enforce with the sword, and it's something that we have to discern, and that requires a certain way of living. And so to answer your question about this, what do we do? I asked that question as I was trying to cash out like the dissertation in the book, that all this study. I began by reading, though. I encountered a Dutch pastor, K.H. Muscote. He hid Jews in Amsterdam during the Nazi occupation. He was a pastor. He wrote a pamphlet that was intended for church Bible study, but it was cryptic. Like it didn't mention Nazis. It didn't do any of the things that would flag the censors. So it went public. And one of the first things he says in this pamphlet is simply that many people are crying out for action, is what he says. Like we all feel it, we all see it. Something must be done. But the church at that point had been totally dissolved in Amsterdam. Like it had been the pious like church life. He talks about it. It's just been ruined. So what do we do? And he says, counterintuitively, and I think this is where Christian ethics helps theology like position ourselves. He says, I think we need to hear again. He says, many are crying out for action, but what if we first need to hear the word afresh? Now, I say this in a typical white evangelical church, and everyone will kind of say, yeah, that's right, like silence, like let's not talk politics. And that's not what he means. Remember, this is a pastor who is hiding Jews, so he was involved. So what he wasn't meaning is like, let's be passive. What he was saying is that let's be Christian, and by being Christian, by worshiping, then the actions will arise as a natural act of obedience, natural risk. So I'll give this and root this in a biblical story, and then I want to hear what everyone else has to say. I've thought a lot, and it's resonated with me deeply about the story of Gideon. Now, the story of Gideon that I was told in my Sunday school of white evangelical churches by incredibly like faithful, and I say that like incredibly earnest people. But the story that they told was one about Gideon, God shrinking his army down and liberating Israel from their oppressors. But there was an essential opening move to that story that I wasn't told, because it probably just didn't fit into the 15 minutes and the cookies and the lemonade afterwards, right? Like, but the thing is that Gideon was actually told by God before he even recruited an army that he was supposed to tear down the idol that his dad had erected in his hometown. Now, before we dismiss that as like, well, that's just primitive, like that's just ancient people, the way that rival gods and idol worship worked in the ancient Near East was that it's all of our isms. it's the things that we think we need to survive, whether that's capitalism, whether that's communism, whether that's socialism, any ism out there. It was their economy. It was their way of livelihood. And Gideon was being asked to tear that down, because Yahweh, God, knew that if he liberated his people without decimating their idol, that idol would be the one who was praised and given worship. So that's my way of kind of settling this thing. I think the question of what should we do arises out of a question of who should we be? And that posture of worship, I think, is essential if we are going to do this as Christians. If we're not going to do this as Christians, then by all means, like let's rush into activism. And I'm not negating activism, but I'm saying that I think there's an order here that Christian ethics, the kind that I'm involved in, like kind of working through and working out, that's where we're called. That's where we hear the word. That's where we're renewed for a work that is risky, for a work that is costly. So I love the question. I think that there's answers that have kind of framed that for me, that I'm thinking, okay, what does that look for me right now? What does it mean to hear the word and to be sent out to do that? Because there's action involved. That's something that I had to grapple with coming out of evangelicalism. So that's kind of my take on it, and I'll sit back and listen at this point.
I love it. And my newsletter is called Smashing Idols, based on that story. So
there you go.
I extra like it. My Substack newsletter. Go check it out. There's my plug. Who else? Somebody else.
You didn't ask me to say that. There you go.
I know. I'll slip you the cash later.
I'll continue that train of thought. I mean, you know, I think sometimes if you're talking to someone who's not a Christian and they're thinking about Christian nationalism, like they're or someone, maybe they're on the fringes of the church, right? And they're really concerned about Christian nationalism. Sometimes their assumption is, like, if this is a dangerous thing, then what we got to do is we need to be less Christian. We need to run away from the church. But I would say the opposite. I would say that Christian nationalism is not, because it's actually a false manifestation of the gospel. The solution is not less Christianity; it's actually more Christianity. It's actually true Christianity, you know. And so I think that Christianity itself gives us the resources to combat Christian nationalism. And I'll say this, you know, one of the main messages of the whole Christian faith is we are not to trust in human beings, we're to trust in God, right? That runs throughout the whole Bible, right? You see this in the 1 Samuel 8 when they're looking to install a king, when the people of Israel are looking to install a king, right? And God makes it clear, like, this guy's not going to be good for you, right? He's going to enslave your people, make you work or whatever, recruit you for their armies. But they do it anyways. They want a king, they want a human leader. And you see all throughout the Psalms, for example, things like, you know, they trust in horses and chariots, but we trust in the name of the Lord. Like David says the same thing. We trust in the name of the Lord. Like the good guys in the Bible are the people who reject this paradigm of putting their trust in human leaders, but they trust in God alone. And that's why, and that comes to a climax when Jesus comes, and people are expecting him to install an earthly kingship, an earthly kingdom. In Acts 1, the disciples ask, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And he basically says, it's not for you to know the time and season, but you're going to be my witnesses, not just to Israel, but Jerusalem, Judea, to the ends of the earth. And he makes it clear, and just, like Jake said earlier in John 18, my kingdom is not this world. Like the purpose of him coming is not to get people to trust in human leaders again, because that was a failed, over and over. We failed at doing that in the Old Testament, right? The whole gospel is that we're not supposed to trust in human leaders. Humans are the ones who we got ourselves into this mess. We can't get ourselves out. We need a savior from outside, and that is Jesus, right? And so I think the danger of Christian nationalism is that it is a return to this pattern of trusting in human leaders again. And I think it's interesting to sort of contrast, like in the book of Revelation, between the beast and the lamb, right? The beast, and I'm not going down conspiracy theories and identifying the beast, okay? But I think, yeah. Anyways, the beast is characterized.
That's for Jared. That's for
Yeah,
Jared, right?
yeah.
Sorry.
It's characterized by lust for power, and there's violence, and there's prostitution, there's all this horrible stuff, and that is characteristic of what human governments throughout history have done. We're horrible. But the lamb, and one of the things I love about Revelations 5, it says, "Worthy are you to open the scroll," and it says, "For you were slain." Like the reason why Jesus is worthy, the reason why he's worthy of worship, the reason why he's a better leader, a better king than anybody else in history, is because he doesn't rule like anybody else. He doesn't rule with an iron fist. He rules through dying, right? His cross, his throne is the cross, and so that is the alternate version of leadership that we are presented with through the gospel. And it's just so disappointing that so many Christians, they are willing to sacrifice that beautiful message of servant leadership, humble leadership, of like Jesus dying for his enemies, and just sacrifice that and trade it for any other government system that has corrupted our race, and so, which is power hungry people corrupted by power, and so yeah, all of that is just to say, that's just an example, but I'm just saying, like, the way we address Christian nationalism, yes, we can, have podcasts, and we can have, Bible study groups, and we can have, rallies and protests, things like that. But I think a lot of it is just, I think churches just need to preach the gospel, and they got to return to the true gospel.
Yeah, love everything that's been shared so far. The two things I'll add is, so two ways I think I try to focus on with resisting Christian nationalism right now. The first way is um, looking around, right? Like look around to Christians right now in the global church living under the boot of empire, people marginalized. And I give a lot of examples of churches and Christian voices like this in my book, The Justice of Jesus. But um, learn from their witness, because they have something to teach us with how they experience the goodness of God right now in our world in very unique ways. So, right now, I've been really blessed listening to Palestinian Christians who don't know if their churches and their land will be bombed tomorrow, quite literally, right? And the grit and tenacity, perseverance, and hope that they have in the Palestinian church, a Palestinian evangelical church, even, right? Like there's something for us to learn there from Christians living on the margins, but also look back to Christians across history who have lived under the boot of different empires, whether it's the early church under the Roman Empire, or my ancestors under the Portuguese Empire or the British Empire being colonized, or the confessing church in Germany under the Nazi Germany Empire. the Black Church under the Southern American Empire, the Confederate Empire, right? There's so many examples of Christians who live faithfully and the hope that they've embodied, and the spiritual practices and the spiritual wisdom that has sustained them in the fight against justice. I've been doing the work of justice long enough to see a lot of people come and go, a lot of well-meaning Christians come and go because they get burned out. Why? Because they don't have the spiritual practices to sustain them in this. And this is why, I've gone the church leader route of cultivating those practices for myself and teaching those practices to the church, because guess what? Our marginalized neighbors deserve the very best of us. And if we get burned out because we don't have the healthy spiritual practices to keep going, then we're doing a disservice ultimately to our marginalized neighbors. But just to give one example of a Christian in the history of the global church who lived in ways resisting Christian nationalism in his context. I'm thinking of Dietrich Bonhoeffer again. And I'll have a Substack called Jesus, Justice, and Joash, and I'm going to put this out this week as exclusive content there. But, this is essentially from Bonhoeffer's sermon around Epiphany time. So we're in the season of Epiphany right now, and as a global church, right? And Epiphany is the season between Christmas and Lent, and it's a season where Jesus reveals himself to the world. But you've got in the text of Matthew 2, you've got Herod, who is the representative of empire, the Roman Empire, oppressing his own people, the Jewish people. And this is what Bonhoeffer writes in Nazi Germany during this Epiphany season, just a few decades ago, really. He says this, he says, "The mighty Herod is dead, but Jesus lives. The mighty Herod is dead, but Jesus lives." And then he goes on to say, um, throughout history, you've had these people who've opposed the church, and the one pattern, the one trend that you see is that they die, but Jesus lives, right? And so it goes on to say, Nero is dead, Diocletian is dead. These are Roman emperors who oppressed the church. The enemies of Luther, Reformation, are dead, but Jesus lives, and with him lives all who are his. The age of persecution suddenly comes to an end and becomes clear: Jesus lives. Um, and again, he's writing this at a time when he had his own Herod, Hitler, committing his own genocide, right? But he's doing this from a posture of faithfulness and hope. And I heard a Palestinian church leader also say this recently, something very similar to this. Saying we don't have optimism here in Palestine right now, but we know that empire doesn't have the final word. Jesus always does. And that's the kind of spiritual wisdom I'm talking about. Let's go there and learn from them and retrieve that spiritual wisdom to sustain ourselves in the resistance against Christian nationalism and against our own desires for power and enrichment.
For those of us who are, this is in the home or the family or the church, my encouragement would view your counterparts not as an enemy to fight, but as a mission field to reach. And I know that missionary has a lot of baggage, so I'm going to use it in the happy way. Christian nationalism argues that you change culture as a conqueror or a crusader, and the way of the gospel is it as an ambassador. So what we've been talking about of like 90% of the work is in me, not them. It's me staying connected to Jesus and me striving to practice the fruit of the Spirit and living the way of Jesus in the presence of others. I think that's so key. But when there's invitation or opportunity to open my mouth, recognizing that, yes, they are saying crazy, harmful, sometimes bigoted things. Agree. But what are you trying to do? Do you want them to reconnect with the way of Jesus and experience a whole body metanoia, repentance, transformation? Or do you want to win? If the objective is to defeat them with your theologically robust Bible arguments, then the game's already over, because now we're taking the posture of a crusader. A missionary takes on the form of a servant, Philippians chapter 2. Jesus is the ultimate missionary. And I know that that sucks to hear. And I know that it's frustrating. And I know that a lot of what's going on is really harmful. But for those of us who are in positions to be at a kitchen table conversation, to recognize this is a missional opportunity. And honestly, some of the people are grifters and they're in this for malevolent or bad faith reasons. Honestly, I think most folks are just scared to death about an uncertain world and a chaotic future. And they're clinging to this because, like Peter in the garden who reaches for the sword when they come to take Jesus, it's the most powerful thing they can imagine. So model for them a faith in the power that's greater than the sword.
Wow, I love that. Thanks everyone for sharing. I mean, to summarize it, I guess you could just kind of say what Jared said earlier. Be a Christian. Like that's the best way to do it. Just live out the gospel. Like, hey, what do you know? We did get a question in the chat here about those Palestinian Christians. This is for Joash there. Joash, if you want to name drop some people there that you've been looking into, reading, watching, things like that.
Yeah, yeah. So uh, Munter Isaac is the name of the person I quoted. He is great. He's a pastor in Bethlehem, actually, right? And um, and then there are others like Mitri Rahib, who wrote this book, Faith in the Face of Empire. That's a good place to start.
Really
There's a
good,
new
yeah.
book that's out, The Cross and the Olive Tree. That's also quite good. Very much like The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which is Black liberation theology, but the Palestinian context. Yeah, and just a lot of voices there. I also quote at least three or four more in my book, The Justice of Jesus. And in fact, if you go to the end of my book, you'll see all the people I cite, and I cite and quote a lot of Palestinian church leaders who have tremendously shaped my life as well. So yeah, so hopefully that's a good place to start, just with the names that I've mentioned here.
Yes, those are good. And look at Caleb repping your book. He's clearly a fan. That's a good endorsement to get there.
He's being like a Berean Christian. He's proof checking that what I said is
That's
true.
right. That's right. Excellent. And I mean, while we're on the subject of books, like Jared has this book coming out in a couple months. I don't know if there's a pre-order link, but follow him. Whatever. We're really excited about that one. I'm really excited about that. I like conspiracy theories as an intellectual exercise, to be clear. Um, Actually, when Jared was originally on Christianity Without Compromise, way back in the beginning when it had a different name, I did ask him on the question. I said, is it okay if I watch Bigfoot documentaries? And if you want to know the answer to that, you have to go back and find that episode sometime in fall of 24. So go check that out. But thank you guys. Really appreciate you talking about Christian nationalism here. It's important. Yes, this is uh, I don't know. It's not a memorial. We're remembering a weird historical event that has its own Wikipedia page. I checked, and it's impacting things. I said earlier, this might end up in textbooks. I don't know. I don't know. But we're talking specifically, 5 years from this insurrection thing, this Capitol attack. Um, but these problems of Christian nationalism, to be clear, and we mentioned this a lot, we're not like invented in America with Donald Trump or something. Um, there's older things that are at play here, and there are older answers because this isn't just something new that popped up. We mentioned a lot of things. I have no idea if I'm going to capture everything in the show notes, but I'm going to try to throw some links and some books and things in the show notes if you're listening to this episode when it comes out on podcast players. But Joash, Jared, Larry, Caleb, again, thank you so much for being on these roundtables, this roundtable discussion. I love these discussions. We try to do them about once a quarter here on the Christianity Without Compromise podcast. Some of our more popular episodes, some of my favorite. because I do a lot less talking and I just get to bask in your intellect. But seriously, I love you guys and I love the things that we've talked about here. Super important. Any last words, closing, whatever? I mean, otherwise, we're wrapping this thing up. Anybody else have anything that needs to be said? Okay. Well, then I am going to wrap it up again. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. Um, Follow these guys on all the places. Read their books and their writings and interact with them because they're really smart. They're really cool. And we pointed you to a bunch of other sources already mentioned that you can check out and learn more from. Would love for you to check out other Christianity Without Compromise podcast episodes too. I'll throw that as my second plug. I got two. I plugged my Substack. Now I'll plug my podcast. But we have some amazing conversations coming up. I get this cool perk as a podcast host. I don't know if you guys knew this. I can read books ahead of time before you guys can, and I've read a lot of books coming out this year that are really really great. So I'm really excited to get to share all those great conversations with you guys. So thank you, everybody. And everybody have a great day or night or wherever it is when you are listening to this.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Pleasure to hang out.